Why you should never date a dismissive avoidant unless this one thing is true. Let me repeat that. Why you should never date a dismissive avoidant if this one thing is true. All right, we're going to dive into this conversation today. And I want to share with you that we're going to talk about something known as love attachment style. And if you're not familiar with love attachment style, I highly recommend you checking out 3 books. Let me grab them for you. Now, the first book I'm going to recommend is Attached by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller. Okay. And you can come back and rewind this and write this down. I also would suggest checking out the book Learning Love by Thais Gibson. Learning Love by Thais Gibson. And I want you to read a book called Wired for Love by Dr. Stan Tatkin. Okay. All the books I recommend are in the books in my show notes called Under Jonathan Recommend Books. Now, I wrote a blog that I'm publishing tomorrow that I want to share with you all today, differentiating between dating a dismissive avoidant and an anxious person. And we're going to dive into the characteristics of why you may not want to consider dating a dismissive avoidant and why you might want to consider an anxious person. So let me read this blog to everyone here. And it goes like this. Let's talk about attachment styles, because dating is already hard enough without accidentally falling for someone who treats vulnerability like it's radioactive. If you've got to choose between an anxious person and a dismissive avoidant, pick the anxious person every single time. Yeah, anxious folks might send a few too many text messages and wonder if you're mad when you just need a nap. But at least they're emotionally present. They want love. They want connection. They're not trying to Jedi mind trick their way out of intimacy with a blank stare and a shrug. You know what you're getting, a heart on the table, maybe slightly bruised, but beating louder and clear. Now let's talk about the avoidant for a second. These folks pull away the second shit gets real. Need a hug? They offer you a calendar invite 2 weeks from now. You want to talk about feelings? Suddenly their phone dies, their Wi-Fi breaks, and they go silent. They go join a silent retreat. But it's a big but. If the avoidant knows their style and actually is working on it, it's a game changer. Emotional accountability is sexy. So unless you want to date someone who ghosts you while you're still sitting next to you on the couch, go with the one who at least who's trying to love out loud. Okay. So that's a blog that I'm posting, and I've got my notes. I want to share with you 10 reasons why you don't want to date an anxious person. And I'm going to share with you 10 reasons why you might want to consider dating an anxious person. And let me share this. There is one secret to dating a dismissive avoidant, and we'll share that in a moment as well. So, putting my notes back here, of the 10 things, emotional unavailability is a dismissive avoidance love language. Good luck getting past the I'm fine. You see, dismissive avoidance fear emotional availability, emotional vulnerability. Boy, I'm tongue-tied today. They fear emotional vulnerability. They struggle with it. And let's look at a romantic relationship beyond the transactional aspects of the relationship. Maybe you're in a relationship because someone needs to support you financially. Maybe you're in a relationship where you need each other from a dependent point of view. But here's the thing. Most people today in the dating marketplace, particularly women, you are no longer dependent upon men from a financial perspective. And the trade-off of cleaning their house and giving them sex whenever they want is thrown out the window. What you're thirsty for, both men and women are thirsty for emotional connection. And yet the dismissive avoidant struggles being emotionally available. Emotional unavailability for these people is their love language. And if you're not familiar with the 5 love languages, I highly recommend checking out the book by Gary Chapman called The 5 Love Languages. And what's fascinating is dismissive avoidant men and women might actually know their love language. But again, expressing a vulnerability is a challenge for them. Number 2, they run when things get intimate. When you're getting close, poof, they disappear. Now, this is a challenge for women because it's tricky to determine this in the early stage of dating, because when men are driven by lust or limerence, if they're driven by their biological needs to be physically intimate with you, then it might appear that they're emotionally available. They might seem like they're totally into you because they're sharing their feelings. Oh my God, it's so amazing to be with you. I can see us traveling together. I can see us being in each other's lives. You're the person I want to marry. So it might seem that they're acting intimate, they're sharing their feelings, but it's coming from that lower chakra. It's coming from the chemicals being released from their body, telling them in a temporary moment, I want to attach myself to this person from a physical sense, but from an emotional sense, a dismissive avoidant, they run when things get intimate. Number 3, they see vulnerability as weakness. That's right. Dismissive avoidant men and women see vulnerability as weakness. They don't want anyone to ever see them sweat. They don't want anyone to ever see that they have insecurities, and they have such walls up in this particular case that it's very difficult to break down these walls when you're with a dismissive avoidant. Now, what's interesting, if you find yourself living with a dismissive avoidant or even married to a dismissive avoidant, you'll feel like you're dating a roommate. Okay, you feel like you're basically, they lock up their heart in the refrigerator. We'll use the home analogy of a refrigerator. You feel like you're dating a roommate. They might make great partners from the physical sense. They might be great at cleaning things. They may be good at fixing things, but literally from an emotional perspective, you'll feel like you're with someone who's just your roommate. By the way, can anyone relate to what I'm sharing right now? Of these few things I've shared, can anyone relate to this? Have you experienced that dismissive avoidant who emotional unavailability is their love language? Number 5 of the dismissive avoidant, they gaslight with silence. That's right. You see, because they're unable to express their emotions, what they're effectively doing when they're silent, they are actually on some level gaslighting you. This is classic. I didn't do anything. See, when you're not doing anything, you're not actually a partner in a relationship. So you got to recognize that when people go silent and they struggle to express themselves, you might feel like you're in a relationship with a blank wall. So just recognize that a dismissive avoidant might have these patterns. Number 6, no conflict resolution skills. No conflict resolution skills. They struggle with conflict, and they have very poor communication skills when they have conflict. Yes, that's right. No conflict resolution skills. In fact, this is probably one of the biggest problems in most romantic relationships. If you haven't read the book, 8 Dates by Doctors John and Julie Gottman, I'm going to turn to chapter 2. Well, actually, it's right here. Agree to disagree. It's called Addressing Conflicts. Folks, do you know why most relationships suffer and fail? They suffer and fail because they have poor skills at resolving conflicts. They have poor skills at resolving conflicts. So yes, this is something we all have to work on. Sadly, we oftentimes operate from the premise, I'm right and you're wrong. I'm right and you're wrong. By the way, all the content I have for you today is done through research, through the internet. I can share with you. These aren't things I've made up. These are the things that are in the books out there. This is all out in the internet universe. If you want to look at some of the issues, you might want to do your own research. And again, you can find all this content out in the universe. They prioritize independence over connection. They tend to be hyper-independent, dismissive avoidance, and they prioritize independence. In other words, they want that freedom to be able to leave at their pace, and they keep distance from someone because they aren't very they tend to be more counter-dependent versus interdependent with another person, and they prefer their independence than actual connection. Oh, here's one. They resent your emotional needs. They resent it. It feels like too much to them. The minute you open up your heart, it feels like it's too much for them. They're not able to meet you in that space. And they resent your emotional needs because then that requires them to step up on an emotional level, and they'd rather stay repressed. You'll question your worth when you're in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant, and they're emotionally stunted. These are just 10 things. Believe it or not, there was a longer list that I had from this, but these were just the 10 that came up. Now, we're going to talk about the dismissive avoidant, and the one thing that needs to happen if you're in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant. But since I started this conversation as to why you might want to consider dating an anxious, and I think it's partially because I'm going to raise my hand. I am very clear that I have an anxious attachment style. I'd like to think I'm moving towards secure, but I'm still in that anxious state in my life. So I'm going to say that there's a slight bit of bias in this conversation, because I'm selling anxious men. Now I know, and anxious women as well. Now I know they don't seem to be the best because they oftentimes operate from a needy place, but let's look at the benefits of dating someone who could be a little bit needy. Okay. They actually want love. Like, they want real connection. Anxious people want real connection. They are thirsty for it. They are so thirsty for it that, yes, they try too hard. Can some of you relate to this? Do you try too hard? It's because we're thirsty for that connection. Now, does that mean does that mean we are deeply wounded? Yeah. But so what? At least we're making effort to it. At least the anxious person is trying to connect at a heart-centered level. Maybe they've got their issues, but they're trying to connect at a heart-centered level. They are emotionally expressive. We use words. Coming back to the 5 love languages, we are thirsty for the words. We are emotionally expressive. Sometimes we vomit all our feelings. We vomit our feelings, but at least we're expressive. Maybe we wear our heart on our sleeve. Maybe we overshare. I'm sorry, I'm putting myself into this category in this share. And then some of you might relate, but we are emotionally expressive. Here's the thing. I do believe what I'm about to say is, anxious people care deeply, maybe too much. Sometimes we try too hard. Sometimes we're people pleasers, but it's because we genuinely care. Now, does this come from maybe being with parents who weren't emotionally very affectionate in our lives? Most likely that's the case. But I will tell you that we can deeply care. Now, once an anxious person is in a relationship, and we're fully committed to this relationship, and it's a monogamous and exclusive relationship, I will tell you, an anxious person will be very loyal in the relationship. This is not to suggest that dismissive avoidants aren't loyal in a relationship, but I will say an anxious person, because they are genuinely seeking that connection, they will be fairly loyal in the relationship. I want you to sit for a moment. If you think you're an anxious person, and come back to the books I recommend. Have you looked back at your past relationships? Have you been loyal? Certainly when there is a connection with another human being, there's a full commitment there. I do believe anxious people tend to be loyal. But again, that's not discounting that a dismissive avoidant can't be loyal as well. An anxious person wants to make you feel safe. They're actually trying to create trust with you. They want you to feel safe in the relationship, even when it's messy. Their heart is in the right place. That's the key piece in this. Listen, I know I've seen this in the early stage of dating, and I know it's an ick, and I know it's a turnoff when a guy tries too hard. Now, we have to be careful when they're chasing sex. Again, it could be a dismissive avoidant. You have to differentiate the guys that are chasing sex versus the guys that are chasing your heart. I'm guilty of writing poems early in the stages of dating. And what I mean is, prior to a first date, I've done things like that. And it's because Now, we think that's going to make you feel safe because every movie we've seen out there seems to suggest that. But again, we've been sold a lot of Disney stories. I think anxious people have been sold a lot of Disney stories. But at the end of the day, we want to make you feel safe. Number 6 for the anxious person, they crave closeness. They crave closeness. You know, anxious people tend to be spooners. They tend to be cuddlers. They're like want as much affection as possible because they're thirsty for it. They crave that closeness. You know, dismissive avoidants struggle with touch, even though they want to physically be intimate with you, but they struggle in that spooning. They struggle getting close because that requires a bit of vulnerability. But that anxious person almost desperately wants closeness. And yes, it's desperate. But here's the thing I didn't say earlier. It's easier to tone down an anxious person than it is to hike up an avoidant person. Let me repeat that. It's easier to tone an anxious person down than it is to get the other person to rise without one thing I'm about to share with you. The thing is about anxious people, they want to make the relationship work. They'll work hard to make the relationship work. They will go to workshops. They'll go to therapy. They'll do whatever it takes to make the relationship work. And it's because number 8, well, let me reframe that. They'll make it work. And number 8 is you will feel wanted. You will feel wanted. In other words, that anxious person makes the other person feel wanted. Now, one thing about anxious people, they tend to be more emotionally aware of their issues than the avoidant person. They read self-help books. Sometimes we read it twice. In my particular case, I have to read a book over and over and over again, just to let it sink in. But we tend to be more emotionally aware because avoidants deflect things. They don't want to face their insecurities. They're not actively looking at working on their stuff. But anxious people tend to be more emotionally aware, but that's not an absolute. And with an anxious person, security and reassurance, they thrive in security and reassurance. They thrive in it. In other words, they seek that in a romantic relationship. All right. So I said, my opinion, this is not a statement of fact. I believe it's easier to tone down an anxious person than to get an avoidant to rise up. Okay. I just think it's either, unless what I'm about to share with you happens. If an anxious person, if an avoidant person genuinely wants to break free from their silo that they're in, this bubble that they're in of self-protection, if they actually want to connect at a heart-centered level, but they don't know what to do, and it is introduced to them these books I recommend, and there's actual interest in working on themselves. If an avoidant says, I'm willing to work on myself to make this relationship work, and if they are genuinely sincere, and I can speak from personal experience, many of you know I host a retreat with one of my clients and her boyfriend, who was a quintessential, he was more like, please forgive me, he was a fearful avoidant. Okay, he wasn't a dismissive avoidant, a fearful avoidant. But here's the thing. He struggled expressing. Emotional unavailability was his love language. And through working with myself, and he's doing some work since then, that awareness to step into a role of working on themselves, then there's a chance that this relationship might work. But if you find yourself with an emotionally dismissive, avoidant man, if they aren't working on themselves, the likelihood of relationship success is very, very, very slim. And I want to encourage you to maybe give that anxious guy a chance, especially if he's really anxious, because it's easier to tone down an anxious person than to lift up a dismissive avoidant. Is this sinking in? Is this resonating with you? Please let me know. I'd like to hear your thoughts on everything I shared. Post a comment below. I do my best to read them all in the first 24 hours. As always, if you find value in my videos, please hit that like button. Please share this video. Please subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so you can be notified of new videos. And if you want to connect with me directly, there's links below to schedule a discovery call with me to see if working with a coach is right for you. There's a link to join my group called Midlife Love Mastery, where you can have direct access to me on a regular basis. Remember all the books I pulled out? There's a list of all the books I recommend. You can go straight to Amazon from each one of those links. And if you want to get my dating vows or follow me on social media, all of the links are listed below.